Good morning. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce the speaker of this special session, Mr. Matt Winkler, who, as you already know, is Editor-in-Chief Emeritus of Bloomberg News, the global news organization with a strength of about 2,700, which he founded with Michael Bloomberg in 1990. And he has the distinction of being its first employee and also its leader for 25 years. Winkler created Bloomberg Journalism Diversity Program in 2015, which was an international partnership with universities conceived to inspire careers in all aspects of economic reporting among students of color. That's in the American context. Winkler also is a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and convenes newsmakers in business, financial markets, and governments worldwide for Bloomberg LP. Now, during Matt's quarter century as editor-in-chief, Bloomberg became the only news organization to receive every top award in every form of print, broadcast, and digital media, including the Pulitzer Prize, the Emmy of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and the National Magazine Award from the American Society of Magazine Editors. Bloomberg News includes more than 150 bureaus throughout North and South America, Europe, and Asia. It publishes 5,000 stories daily, Bloomberg Business Week and Bloomberg Markets magazines, and produces Bloomberg Television and Radio, which is a 24-hour network reaching more than 350 million households worldwide, and its portal, Bloomberg.com. Matt received the 2012 Lifetime Achievement Award from the City University of New York Graduate School of Journalism, the 2007 Gerald Loeb Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing, quote, exceptional career achievements in business, financial, and economic news writing, unquote. The 2007 Emmy Lifetime Achievement Award for Business and Financial Reporting, the National Council for Research on Women Award in 2010 for promoting women and the YWCA NYC for promoting women, and the YWCA NYC Man of the Year Award in 2013 for promoting diversity and female-focused initiatives. The Security and Exchange Commission's ban on selective disclosure of corporate information, known as Reg FD, was prompted by Bloomberg News' reporting of market manipulation in the 1990s. This is about the impact of the kind of stories Bloomberg has done. Market manipulation in the 1990s, and the Federal Reserve's disclosure of unprecedented loans during the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and resulted after courts affirmed that Bloomberg's Freedom of Information Act suit against the central bank, for which it received a special citation from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government at the 2012 Goldsmith Awards. Bloomberg News has received more than 800 awards during Matt Winkler's leadership, including the Pulitzer for explanatory reporting, Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights Journalism, Roy W. Howard for Public Service, George Polk, Gerald Loeb, Overseas Press Club, Sidney Hillman, Investigative Reporters and Editors, Society of Professional Journalists, Society of American Business Editors and Writers, and National Magazine Awards for General Interest, Best Cover, and Best Single Topic. Winkler is co-author of Bloomberg by Bloomberg, published in April 1997, and author of The Bloomberg Way, a guide for reporters and editors, which many of you are familiar with. If you aren't, there are multiple copies in the library, which was published in 2014. His lectures at more than 24 universities include the commencement address at Northwestern Medill University of Journalism in 2010 where he was a visiting professor, featured speaker at Columbia University's annual conference at the Center for Capitalism and Society, inaugural lecture at the Journalism School of Sciences Po in Paris, and the Woodrow Wilson School's thematic lecture series at Princeton. Between 1991 and 1994, he wrote Capital Markets column for Forbes magazine. Between July 1980 and February 1990, he was reporter for the Wall Street Journal, this is going way back, and news service of parent Dow Jones & Co. in New York and London. He was a New York-based reporter, an assistant editor at the Bond Buyer way back in the 1970s, and a reporter for the Ohio-based Mount Vernon News, also in the 1970s. He's a member on the boards of several international organizations, including the International Center for Journalists, that is the ICFJ, and the International Women's Media Foundation. So that is Matt Winkler, and the topic, as you know today, is Trump's tariffs are more tangled than tying a bow tie. I assure you he's not wearing a bow tie because the title demands it, but he always turns up that's part of his persona. Year after year at the ACJ, he has not once come without the distinctive bow tie. So, ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to listening to Matt Winkler. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you, Sashi, and thank you for having me. I only wish my mother could have heard what you just said. Would have made her very happy. Trump's tariffs are more tangled than tying a bow tie. You're wondering, what could that possibly be about? Before I get to the bow tie, I just want to reference a few things that happened recently, like yesterday. Tariffs. There's something that was coined by a journalist from the Financial Times called TACO, and it means Trump always chickens out. And it's a relevant and timely term because, as you know, yesterday we learned that the threat of tariffs anew, I say anew because they began months ago, were suddenly withdrawn after a major collapse in the financial markets and a great deal of chaos, which is now a trend. Every time we see something like this, we get the taco trade, as it's referred to. You know, I've come kind of late to this subject, tariffs, mostly because so many economists around the world with credentials that are unimpeachable have concluded, not just recently, but during the past, really the past 60, 70 years, that tariffs are totally unproductive for trade, commerce, totally inconsistent with what Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney talked about at Davos earlier this week. Rules, norms, civil behavior, and so forth. But I did actually come upon tariffs personally, and I wanted to share that experience with you because what I experienced actually was very much consistent with what so many economists have written about already. This all begins, if you will, last April, so-called Liberation Day, as Trump referred to it. And he and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said, tariffs imposed on imports to the United States aren't a tax on American consumers. And of course, economists, as I said, have been saying the opposite. So today, with all of you, I want to share with you something that has been a practice at Bloomberg News since its inception almost 36 years ago. And that is, of course, we follow the money, and we also recognize that the prevailing narrative is often belied by the data. So, as I said, the prevailing narrative was informed by everything Trump and his enablers say, and they're in official positions, and every time they say it, of course, it goes around the world. And so, millions like me of Americans who are purchasing goods at stores, online. In my case, it was getting ready for the holiday season late last year. And there's a number that actually shocked me from personal experience. The number is 10. That's the additional cost of acquiring a set of bow ties from the UK. One of more than 200 countries, allies, adversaries alike, that Trump has imposed tariffs on most imported goods. And the first time in my septuagenarian life, I received a letter from the United Parcel Service, or rather, an international package services invoice. At first, I thought it must be a scam, as the invoice arrived after I received the ties. Listed were government charges of $6.92, brokerage charges of $14, totaling $20.92, with instructions to pay UPS Supply Chain Solutions at a designated bank. The tariff rate listed for each of the ties was 10%, 7.5%, and 7.2%, without any explanation of why these rates differ. Well, I realized belatedly that the purchases, which were from a business that caters to alumni seeking the badge of their alma mater, they cost 10% more than the listed prices because the people who are asking me to pay this tax, of course, they're not from the UK. They're my fellow Americans. The most powerful, as I mentioned before, insist there's no empirical evidence prices are rising because of tariffs. Well, to be sure, members of the Trump administration say all sorts of things that contradict established business norms, economic principles. And just recently, in fact, it's been 9 months or so since we got a look at these tariffs, since Liberation Day. And the Institute of World Economics confirmed what had already been data compiled by Harvard University and Yale University. Americans are paying 96% of the cost of the tariffs. And if you look at what's happened since to the American economy and the world economy, things have not gone as well as predicted initially at the beginning of last year. If you look at the Paris-based OECD predictions on the economy, it's growing slower than what was predicted in January. And that's similar with inflation, of course. The person who is probably mostly in authority, more so than anyone, on tariffs and trade, happens to be the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, who actually received his Nobel Prize in economics in 2008, precisely on this subject of tariffs and trade. And, you know, late last year, when he was looking at all of this, he said essentially that the tariffs are going to be unproductive, disruptive, and ultimately reduce the credibility and authority of world order as we know it, and especially the U.S. economy, and the worst is yet to come. A prescient remark last October, given that yesterday Europe, of course, the EU, called Trump's bluff, and that was the first example where, if you like, the taco trade once again came to the fore. But this is not really the only example that we've seen. Part of the challenge of news and news makers and news reported by journalists is what is the underlying truth behind the narrative that prevails. And the narrative that prevails, of course, has been one that whatever Trump says gets reported. It gets reported repeatedly. It goes around the world. And it continues to circulate, when in fact most of what he says, unfortunately, isn't true. I want to digress for a second, and you know what? I think I'll untie my bow tie, just because I'm now talking about. I said I'm going to digress for a second. What do the tariffs mean for India? Well, since last April, India's monthly exports to the U.S. dropped $3.4 billion, or 30%, to $7.8 billion in August. This is the biggest 5-month export decline since data was compiled in 1960. Now, how to put this into context? How do we put it into context at Bloomberg? There are at least 25 publicly traded Indian companies in India, that receive 25% or more of their revenue from the United States. In this period, their shares lost 11% during the past 12 months, when the stock market in India gained 4% during the same period. And you can see that here. My colleague Shenpei, who is never far from my side, is providing this data compiled by Bloomberg, and ever so grateful for him doing so. Analysts told Bloomberg, when they submit their reports, that these 25 Indian exporting companies' revenues are going to grow 9%, 13%, and 13% again in the next 3 years. And that you can see in this handy chart. So what should be the narrative, what should be the headline, is often overlooked, typically overlooked, because people are not always paying attention to what the data tells us and shows us. I want to consider another example. The oil business. before and after Trump was elected, on the campaign trail, and then once he was inaugurated, he promoted the assertion that the world would benefit from drilling oil, and that he was stating a new, if you like, economic trend of a booming fossil fuel oil industry, traditional energy. Up until that point, in the previous administration, and even before that, the trend had been that clean energy, alternative energy, solar, wind, battery-powered energy was outperforming as an investment fossil fuel. So January begins, we have a new regime, and President Trump is asserting that and making it clear to all concerned that his policies will favor fossil fuel and punish alternative energy in due course. So again, looking at data compiled by Bloomberg, we took this assertion seriously, drill baby drill, which is what he repeatedly said. He backed that up with executive orders to slow offshore wind, curb California's ability to phase out gasoline-powered cars, and expand offshore drilling leases. And he actually said in his inaugural address, the inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending, escalating energy prices. That is why today I will declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill. That's a direct quote. So, follow the money. How have investors reacted to what Trump and his administration initiated? And the way we went about it at Bloomberg is we looked at, if you like, a group, a cohort of companies. It's got a name, it's called the City Renewable Energy Basket, but it includes 42 companies based in the United States. They're involved in the design, development, and production of what we call clean energy, meaning energy that does not come from fossil fuel, does not come from the ground. Energy that is derived from solar, wind, and other forms of energy that have nothing to do with oil and gas. So we looked at this group of companies. We also looked at 18 U.S. companies that are specifically involved in solar energy, solar development, servicing, production of energy. And we compared these cohorts with the Standard & Poor's 500 index, which is the benchmark of the U.S. stock market. It has, by the way, 22 traditional so-called energy companies, many of which you're doubtless familiar with. So we followed the money and said, okay, what happened since and before Trump was in office? He came into office in January 25, as I said. Since that time, renewable energy, it's a group of companies, gained 50%. That's the green line on this chart you're looking at. Solar gained 36%. That's the blue line on this chart. Traditional energy gained 7%. That's the fossil fuel crowd, the red line. And the S&P 500, which is the entire stock market benchmark, is the white line that gained 17%. So as you see, even though Trump, as he will, is asserting something, and it's by far the overwhelming headline, the overwhelming narrative that everybody reads, listens to, and watches during 2025, the data showing people with the most at stake, otherwise known as investors, were doing, if you like, exactly the opposite. Or I should say, they were doing what they were doing before Trump came into office, when Biden was president. The result, if we look at the past 6 months, is similar. It means that investors never took him seriously. So this is another example, if you will, of the taco trade, although it's somewhat different in that they never bothered even to consider the truth of anything he was saying. Another way to look at this, by the way, is what do analysts say is coming next? What are the next steps? What's the future? And then we look at the revenue forecasts of these companies and what analysts have to say about them. Renewable companies, alternative energy, otherwise known as clean energy, will see 17% revenue growth next year and 21% in 2027. Solar companies are going to see 11% sales increases and 10% in 2027. Traditional energy, 2% next year and 6% in 2027. Okay, now it's time to put my tie back together again. You know, I said that, you know, these tariffs are more tangled than a bow tie. I just wanted to prove it to you how complicated these tariffs are, because I'm just going to tie my bow tie again, just so we're in sync with each other, you know. And I'll get to another point in a second. Okay, we're almost there. All right, so you see, not too bad, right? It's sort of simple, right? Tariffs, not so much. Okay, let's get back to Trump and his own economy, his own work, and that would be a company he created. It's called Trump Media. I want to share with you some data compiled by Bloomberg about Trump Media and Technology Group, Corp. All right. There are 20 internet media services companies in the Russell 1000 index. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Russell 1000 is, it's, you know, that's everybody you can find publicly traded. In 2025, investors in TMTG, that's the Trump Media and Technology Group Corp., has a ticker symbol of DJT, Donald Trump, DJT. It happened to be the worst performing company among these 20 firms, which Shin generously shares with us on this slide. Not only is TMTG the worst performer on this list this year, but it's also lost to every single peer on a 3-month basis, on a 6-month basis, on a 1-year basis, on a 3-year basis. It doesn't happen very often to many companies. And since the election of November 5th, 2024, its shares have declined 59%. That's the circle, the green circle. And since January 2025, the shares are down 65%. That's the red circle. In fact, since the inauguration, there hasn't been a single day when the share price of this company created by Donald Trump is higher. It's never gotten above where it was. By the way, we go to the Bloomberg, no analysts are reporting their forecast to Bloomberg. What does that mean? So you want to know what's going on with the share performance, forecast, revenue growth, forecast, all that stuff? Go to the Bloomberg, and you can get that on pretty much any publicly traded company. TMTG is showing an empty row among these 20 domestic peers. Black space. That's it. Nobody's submitting any forecast for this company. It's one of 7 companies in the Russell Index with no consensus rating for a target share price. And on December 18th last year, the company announced the acquisition of a nuclear company called TAE Technology. Even after the shares rose 41% on the day of the news, half of that gain was gone by the next week. Unfortunately, what I'm sharing with you isn't entirely a surprise, isn't, sad to say, really news you've never seen before. By that I mean, Trump styled himself as a businessman. And with a lot of money behind him and a lot of business people supporting him, he came into office as somebody who was proficient as a businessman, first in 2016, and then last year on the campaign trail, he said, I'll eliminate inflation as we know it, and the economy will never be better. Well, in 2016, when there was a campaign, our profession could have reported that Trump is the only person in history who owned casinos who went bankrupt 6 times owning casinos, okay? No one who owns casinos has ever had that experience anywhere around the world. Now, you might think that context and perspective would inform the narrative on this 2016 campaign trail, but it'd be hard to find stories on the front page or page 24 in 2016 anywhere that referenced his 6 bankruptcies. Pretty much everything Trump has created as a business has failed except for one: entertainment, himself. He was very good at creating a show in which he fired people. And that's the persona of him as a businessman. By the way, in 2016, when he ran against the previous administration, Barack Obama was president, and then the candidate Hillary Clinton, somehow no one anywhere reported that in January 2016, the U.S. was the only economy in the world that had recovered from the financial crisis to the extent that its GDP had exceeded its previous record. No other economy in the world had gotten that far. So the U.S. was already on a path to recovery, and that was true in January and February and March and April and so on, all the way through to November. And you didn't see that as a headline, a lead, a nut graph, anything anywhere. That the Obama economy was actually the best performing economy in the world in 2016 when Donald Trump was running against it and, of course, ultimately prevailed in that election. Similarly, last year, the Biden economy according to The Economist, was the envy of the world. Inflation was trending lower. Biden's administration prevailed to the extent that more manufacturing jobs were created in the U.S. in the 4 years that Biden was president than any other president going all the way back to the 1970s when I began my career as a newspaperman. Again, that context and perspective was missing from the prevailing narrative. The gap between the rich and the poor, known as inequality, actually narrowed in the 4 years that Biden was president. But what was our profession writing about? Biden's age, his age, and that whatever he said didn't seem to quite add up. That was what we were writing about. You want to compare? There was a debate, if you recall, in June last year that started all that. If you were deaf and you read the transcript of what Biden said and what Trump said, actually what Biden said, because you didn't hear the stuttering, you didn't hear the pauses, it made some sense. But if you read everything that Trump said in that debate, which he supposedly won, none of it was true. And like yesterday at Davos, it didn't make any sense. So maybe we'll learn, maybe we will actually remember Mark Carney's speech as the speech that's worth remembering, not just this year, but in the years to come. And I've tied my bow tie, but unfortunately the tariffs are still horribly tangled. I think I'm supposed to answer some questions at this point. Thank you very much.